I watched my own funeral from a cabin in the woods, because dying was the only way to survive what they did to me. I think every guy, at some point, asks himself that question. That gut punch question. Is she cheating? For me though, I don't have to wonder. I know. My wife is being unfaithful. She just doesn't realize that I've figured it out. I guess to make sense of where I am now, it helps to go back a bit. I had a pretty regular upbringing, nothing fancy. I grew up in a modest home with two parents who cared deeply about me, and an older sister who, bless her heart, somehow tolerated having me as her little shadow. My mom and dad were big on fairness, respect, and learning. They did what they could to give us a better life, so they sent me to this private school they thought would set me up for success. It was an all-boys Catholic school, rigid in its traditions. Football first, faith second, academics somewhere down the line. The kind of place where you prayed hard, played harder, and didn't question much. Right across from us was a girls' school we occasionally mingled with for events. But let me tell you, there's nothing lonelier than being a middle-class kid stuck in a sea of wealthy snobs at a religious school when you aren't even religious yourself. I never stood a chance of fitting in. I hated pretense. Always believed that people should be judged by how they treat others, not by how fat their wallets were. Apparently that made me the odd one out. The poor boy. It didn't take long before I became a target, mocked, cornered after school, and thrown into fights I never asked for. Sometimes I got a lucky shot in, but more often than not, I was outnumbered and overpowered. I didn't bother telling my parents. They were peace-loving people who believed in turning the other cheek. I knew all I'd get was a gentle reminder to try and blend in. But blending in wasn't an option. The school had a rule. Every student had to be involved in some sort of sport, either through school or outside of it. Most of the rich kids stuck with football, but I didn't want anything to do with them after hours. That's when I came across the Police Boys Club, a boxing gym that had the school's stamp of approval, probably because the police chief's son went to our school. I figured it was a way to stay out of trouble, and maybe be able to hold my own if trouble found me. Joining that gym turned out to be a pivotal moment in my life. Not just because it toughened me up, but because it brought people into my world who finally made me feel like I belonged. These weren't trust fund kids or preppy honor students. These were kids like me, rough around the edges, scrappy, and trying to figure things out one punch at a time. That's where I met Greg Sanders. Greg was a natural. His dad was a local cop and they'd just moved into town. He signed up for boxing just to stay active, not that he needed it. He was already a regional champion, not that any of us knew that back then. We were around the same weight, so the coach paired us up for a friendly spar. I didn't even have time to be nervous. Greg just flashed this grin, easy, friendly, and then, boom, a blur of red. That was the last thing I saw before my lights went out. When I finally came to, I was lying under a blinding white light in the back room of the gym, head throbbing like a drum. Took me a second to piece together what had happened. The instructor came by with this half smile on his face and said something like, "Well, kid, I've seen enough to know it's gonna be a long road for you." I guess that was his version of encouragement. Not long after that, Greg Sanders, who everyone eventually started calling Sandman, walked in looking sheepish. He offered me a handshake and apologized for knocking me clean out. I took his hand, and from that moment we were solid. Just like that, we were friends. We hit it off quick. I started showing him around town, introducing him to my folks and the few friends I had outside of school. In turn, I met his parents, good people, down to earth. His dad was a deputy chief of police, and even though he had that authority vibe, he was kind and respectful. The big surprise came a week later back at school. I was walking through the hallway, just another ordinary day, when I saw someone familiar leaning against the locker. It was Greg. I lit up, ran over, and we both smiled like a couple of kids who just pulled off a secret. Turns out, because of his dad's position in the department, Greg had managed to get a reduced tuition deal and transferred into our school. That summer before our senior year was probably one of the best I can remember. Sandman and I spent almost every day together, working out at the gym, running through the trails, just talking about life and everything ahead of us. He even tried chatting up my older sister once, but she was heading off to college soon and wanted nothing to do with a high schooler, no matter how charming he was. Life settled into a rhythm after that. There were still the occasional stares from the rich boys at school, but no one messed with me anymore. Douglas Peterson, the guy who used to go out of his way to make my life miserable, swore he'd get revenge. But it wasn't the kind that came with fists. After that sparring incident, he and everyone else knew not to cross Sandman. That kid had a punch that made people see stars. By the time our final year rolled around, we were already walking different paths. I knew I had the grades and the focus to chase down a business degree. Sandman, on the other hand, had his eyes set on the military. Special forces, to be exact. And knowing him the way I did, I never once doubted he'd pull it off. When Greg committed to something, he saw it through. What I didn't know then was that once we parted ways after graduation, it would be years before I'd see him again. Officer training came next for me. It wasn't easy, but I took to the hands-on stuff better than I expected. Sure, the classroom work was a grind, but the practical training? I loved it. I pushed through because I knew what was waiting for me at the end, my own chance to start something meaningful. A business. Something I could build from the ground up. The morning I graduated, my mom made me a big breakfast. Eggs, bacon, the works. We ate together in the kitchen just like old times. Afterward, I headed out to help my dad open up his store. That was supposed to be just another part of a normal day. But that's when everything changed. I heard my name, Roger Easton, and turned around. Standing there in front of me was Susan Bates, an old classmate. Only now she was going by Susan Peterson. That threw me off. I hadn't heard Doug had tied the knot. She was there with a stunning brunette by her side. "Hey Susan, how've you been?" I asked, trying to play it cool. "I'm good, Roger," she replied with a grin. "But it's Susan Peterson now." She glanced at the woman next to her. "This is my cousin Kelly. We're in town for the festival. Doug's overseas on a work trip." Susan introduced me to Kelly and, well, what can I say? Sometimes life puts someone in your path and things just click. With Kelly, everything felt easy from the start. Things moved fast after that. Kelly and I started dating not long after that festival, and before I even realized it, nearly 2 years had gone by. We grew close, really close. Kelly had a more traditional view of relationships. She believed in waiting until marriage before taking that final step, and while I respected her convictions, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't tough at times. Still, the flip side was that we built something real. We talked about everything, learned each other inside and out. We didn't skip steps. We built a foundation. If there was one thing that cast a shadow over our time together, it was Susan Peterson, and, by extension, her husband, Doug. Yeah, that Doug. The same smug rich kid from school who used to make life miserable for guys like me. Now he was this big-time executive, somehow always hovering at the edge of our life. Kelly knew how I felt about the two of them, but I didn't make a fuss. For her sake, I kept my thoughts to myself. Most of the time, anyway. Then came the cruise. Kelly told me she had just gotten promoted. Big news. She'd be reporting directly to none other than Doug Peterson, CEO of Peterson Corporation. Apparently, Doug had asked her to accompany him on a tour of several company branches across the country. The reason? Layoffs. Kelly was now in charge of handling the HR side of things. She tried to frame it as a professional milestone, something exciting. But I couldn't shake this knot in my gut. I nodded, smiled even, but inside, I was uneasy. "Doug's not the same guy he used to be," she said one night, catching my expression. "He's married now. This is strictly business." I wanted to believe her. But some instincts don't quiet down just because you want them to. The morning she left, Doug pulled up in a limo. He stepped out in a tailored suit, flashing that same overconfident grin I remembered from high school. He waved at me like we were old friends. I waved back out of politeness, but inside I was screaming. He looked different. Older, sure. Maybe even more polished. But the grin? That hadn't changed a bit. I hadn't seen him in almost a decade, so I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. People grow up. Life humbles them. Maybe he wasn't that same entitled jerk anymore. That's what I told myself anyway. Meanwhile, my head was already spinning for a whole different reason. Something personal I hadn't told Kelly. I'd recently found out that I might be sterile. It shook me, but I hadn't brought it up with her yet. We'd been talking about having kids for a while, but with her new promotion and busy travel schedule, that dream had quietly taken a back seat. Part of me didn't want to ruin her momentum with bad news. Another part of me was just plain scared to find out how she'd take it. The following week flew by. Work kept me on my feet, and Kelly called a few times while she was on the road with Doug. The conversations were short, pleasant, but surface level. I didn't press. I figured she had her hands full. Still, something gnawed at me. When she got back, things felt off. Not in a dramatic, obvious way, but I could sense the shift. She was more distracted, more guarded. She chalked it up to stress and the weight of the job. I tried to accept that, but our relationship had changed. We used to be physically close, sharing our time, our space. But now, our intimacy had dwindled. We went from being together a few times a week to once a week, then once every couple of weeks, if that. It hurt, but I kept telling myself it was just a phase. Then came that afternoon at the bar. It was one of those sticky, quiet days where a cold beer sounded like heaven. I had just sat down when I saw someone I vaguely knew, someone who was part of that social circle surrounding the Petersons. She greeted me with a smirk and a raised brow. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. "Not at all," I said, motioning to the seat. She flagged down the bartender and ordered a drink, then looked at me sideways. "So, what brings you here, Roger?" I didn't dance around it. I leaned in a little and asked the question that had been chewing me up from the inside out. "Is Doug seeing my wife?" She nearly choked on her drink. "Jesus, Roger. You don't mess around." "Nope," I said. "I've had enough small talk. It's all over town, isn't it?" When I said Susan started crying, I meant it came out of nowhere. One minute we were talking and the next she just broke down. She confessed that she'd left Doug, that she was back living with her parents, and that a divorce was already in the works. Said it was only a matter of time. According to her, the marriage had never really been about love. They'd been pressured into it, expected to make it work because of image and status. But the resentment between them ran deep. Doug didn't even try to keep up appearances. He started sleeping around not long after the wedding and never cared to hide it. Susan even told me about a dinner where he openly flirted with someone right in front of her. Later that evening, after Susan and her cousin left, I asked Kelly if she wanted something to drink. She shook her head, so I grabbed a cold beer from the fridge. As I turned back, Kelly rushed into my arms, clinging to me like she was holding on for dear life. Tears streamed down her face and she told me she needed to talk. Through choked sobs, she started explaining what had happened. Susan had called her the day before, apparently to thank her for making me available again. Kelly had no idea what that even meant and thought Susan was joking at first. But then something about it just didn't sit right. She began calling me, leaving message after message. I hadn't returned any of them. After a few days of silence from me, she got in her car and drove straight over to my parents' place. She didn't find me there, but I'd left a message on our answering machine, telling her I'd be helping my dad at the store until Sunday. I figured she'd be at work and wouldn't notice I was gone until later anyway. Truth was, I needed space, time to clear my head and think. With that handled, I packed up the car, gave my folks a hug and headed back to the city. I didn't go home though. I wasn't ready for any of that. Instead, I checked into a modest hotel just outside the downtown area, close enough to everything but far enough that I wouldn't bump into anyone I knew, especially Doug. That night, I finally heard back from Sandman. He said, "Leave it with me, Roger. I've got some contacts who can dig into this. I'll find out what's really going on." He admitted he was surprised. "Kelly never struck me as the type," he said. I sighed and replied, "Yeah, me neither. Or else I wouldn't have married her." We let the heavy stuff hang for a moment before switching gears. We sat there until the early morning hours, trading stories, remembering the old days and catching up like no time had passed at all. The next morning hit me like a freight train. My head was pounding and I felt like I might throw up. After a long shower and a greasy breakfast that didn't help much, I finally started to feel somewhat human again. And then Sandman called with news. Turns out, Doug's reputation was about to catch up with him. One of Sandman's contacts said Doug's name had come up in an ongoing investigation, something about drug trafficking. Apparently, one of Doug's suppliers had flipped, and it looked like he was about to be caught with his hand in the cocaine jar. I couldn't have asked for a better Christmas gift. That night, I celebrated alone with a couple of beers at the hotel bar. Then I drove home. To my wife. When I walked through the door, Kelly was waiting. She was affectionate, warm, like she used to be. We spent the evening together and for a moment, it felt like things might be okay again. Afterward, she rolled over, curled up beside me and whispered, "I have a surprise for you." I turned toward her, curious. Her eyes lit up as she said, "Roger, you're going to be a father." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I stared at her, completely frozen. My face must have gone pale because she took my silence as joy. She beamed at me, eyes bright and full of hope. Meanwhile, my thoughts were a storm: uncertainty, fear, doubt. And then, as if the universe couldn't resist twisting the knife, I saw Doug later that week. Stepping out of his office, smug as ever, sliding into a brand new BMW Z4 Roadster like nothing in the world could touch him. I followed Doug that evening. I didn't really have a plan. I was running on instinct, anger, and a deep, gnawing need for answers. He drove across town and eventually stopped outside an apartment complex I didn't recognize. As he stepped out of his car and made his way toward the front entrance, I pulled up behind him, threw my door open, and jumped out. "Doug!" I called out, voice sharp, unwavering. He spun around like a man who'd just seen a ghost. Looking back, maybe the way I handled it was a bit over the top. But in that moment, it felt like the smartest move I'd made all week. He didn't run. He couldn't. I could see it in his face, the fear. He thought I was going to hurt him. "Roger, please," he said, stumbling over his words. Don't kill me. I swear I didn't touch Kelly." His hands were shaking. He looked pale, completely drained. Whether he was lying or telling the truth, it didn't matter right then. The power had shifted. For once, Doug Peterson wasn't in control. After I calmed down, we talked. Sort of. I didn't buy everything he said, but I needed to think it through to gather more than gut feelings. So I left Doug to squirm in his guilt, or his innocence, whatever it was, and made some calls of my own. The first one was to Sandman. He didn't answer. Next, I reached out to Mr. Peterson Sr., Doug's father. I figured if there was anyone who knew what was really going on behind closed doors, it was him. To my surprise, when the secretary transferred me, he picked up and handed the phone straight to me. No formalities. No pleasantries. Just a low, irritated voice promising I'd receive a complete report on Greg Sandman Sanders in a few days. But that only answered one of my questions. The second question was harder. Why would Sandman target Doug at all? I shrugged it off during our talk with a vague answer, but the truth was, deep down, I had a theory. A bad one. I believed that all this, everything unraveling around me, wasn't really about Kelly at all. I was just collateral damage. A pawn in a long-standing, twisted game between two powerful men who had history, resentment, and a hunger to come out on top. I sat in that room with Doug for over an hour, both of us waiting in heavy silence. He fidgeted, made calls, looked over his shoulder like a man expecting the floor to collapse at any second. But what got to me more than anything he said, or didn't say, was the realization that none of this had been about me. Not really. I was just in the way. When I got that report a few days later, it hit like a freight train. It detailed everything. From Sandman's early days in the police force to his classified deployment records, right up to his personal entanglements. Apparently, Sandman and Kelly had a connection long before I was in the picture. Things between them had turned serious while he was stationed nearby, and he'd fallen hard for her. She seemed to feel the same at first. But then he proposed. Kelly refused. Said not until he got her father's blessing. And General Bates? That man would rather see the sun freeze over than give his approval to a soldier like Greg. Within weeks, Sandman's unit was shipped off to the Middle East. Not just any tour, he was sent on the most dangerous missions imaginable. Men in his unit started dying. One by one. Greg survived. Barely. But he came back different. And angry. Once he realized what had happened, that the general had deliberately tried to bury him, Sandman changed. His mission became personal. That's when I knew I had to get Kelly out of town. I didn't have proof that Sandman was targeting her, or me, but I had a feeling in my bones. And I've learned to trust that feeling. The first step was to keep her safe, somewhere far from this web of betrayal and revenge. After that, I'd have to make a decision. Brace for the storm I saw coming, or disappear before it hit. I drove home, hands tight on the wheel the whole way. When I stepped inside, the place was eerily quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't sit right. I called out for Kelly, no answer. Our dog usually came running the moment I walked in, tail wagging. Nothing. I did a quick lap through the house. Everything looked normal. Neat. Tidy. But our dog was gone. And suddenly nothing felt normal at all. I made my way upstairs, my steps heavy as if the house itself was weighed down by everything unsaid. When I stepped into the master bedroom, I stood still for a moment, just breathing in the silence. That's when it hit me. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a story that wasn't mine anymore. I had to let it all go. Let Sandman have the Bates family, let them play their twisted games. I wanted no more part in it. I'd already stayed too long, trying to patch up a future that had been shattered the moment Kelly made her choice. And that's what stung the most. I did love her. I really did. But whatever we had, it had died quietly long before I ever saw it coming. She had never really let go of Sandman. I was just a detour. A placeholder. That kind of realization doesn't just bruise, it breaks something inside you. Part of me wanted revenge. I wanted Kelly to feel the weight of what she did to me. I wanted Sandman to know what it was like to lose something you thought you owned. But another part of me, the deeper part, knew that kind of fire would burn me down long before it ever touched them. And then, as I stood there in the doorway of what was once our room, I realized what I needed to do. Disappear. I had stayed in touch with an old friend, Brian Moses, my former sergeant from back in my Army days. After retiring from the military, he'd started a quiet life on the coast, fixing up an old beach house about 2 hours out of the city. More importantly, he had connections. The kind you don't talk about on the phone. I didn't waste time. Threw what I needed in a duffel bag and hit the road, pushing my car to its limits, every mile bringing me closer to something that felt like freedom. When I pulled up, Brian was out by the dock, shirt off, fixing something in the sun. He looked up, nodded like he'd been expecting me. I didn't want to drag him into my mess, but I didn't have a choice. I laid it out the best I could, at least the parts that mattered. No names, no unnecessary details. Just the truth I needed out. A fresh start. A new life. And I needed it fast. He didn't blink. Just said, "Give me a couple days." 2 days later, I was no longer Roger Easton. I was just green now. I had a new driver's license. Clean social security number. Credit cards. Birth certificate. Everything I needed to vanish the right way. It wasn't cheap, but it was solid. The kind of work that could stand up to scrutiny. I left the documents hidden with Brian for now. He was also going to secure a second-hand car for me. Nothing flashy, just something that wouldn't raise questions. I handed him the cash and told him I'd come back soon. But before Roger Easton could vanish for good, he had to die. Back in my army days, I remembered a story one of the guys told me. There was this old town called Hell, a literal place on the map, not far from where I was headed. Just outside of it there was a spot. A black zone. A stretch of cliff where, for decades, people had taken their final drives. Whether it was desperation or darkness, the result was always the same. It was the kind of place that didn't just end lives, it erased them. I drove there next, stopping in the small town nearby before heading to the cliffs. It was alive in the way small towns often are, quiet but curious. I introduced myself to the locals, farmers, shop owners, even the mayor. Told them I was passing through, maybe considering a place to settle down. They welcomed me like I was already one of them. By the end of breakfast, half the town knew my name, Roger Easton. That was important. That night, I went to the local bar, packed with people and full of life. I made sure to talk to everyone. I was generous, friendly. I bought round after round of drinks. Everyone assumed I was just a cheerful guy with deep pockets and no worries. They didn't realize I only drank 1.5 beers the entire night. The rest? I left half finished, set aside, or quietly handed off. I wanted them to believe I was getting tipsy. And I made sure they did believe it. The setup had begun. For one night I was the great guy. The friendly out-of-towner. The generous soul everyone toasted. Roger Easton. What I didn't count on was the bartender having a conscience. Toward the end of the night, he pulled me aside. Said I didn't look fit to drive, that maybe I should stay the night and sober up. A nice gesture. A good man doing the right thing. But it threw a wrench in the plan. I left anyway. I followed the directions Brian had given me and reached the cabin around midday. It was tucked deep in the woods. No cell towers, no neighbors, just silence and trees. Exactly what I needed. I unloaded my things and took a long, slow look around. The place had a rough charm. Plain wood interiors, a small fireplace, and enough room for one man trying to vanish. Brian had thought ahead. He'd stocked the place with enough canned goods and dry food to last me at least a month. There was even a stash of toiletries and a few worn-out books. I made a mental note to let the beard grow out before stepping into town again. I needed to look different. Feel different. I couldn't be Roger Easton anymore, not even in the mirror. My biggest concern at that point was whether the world would actually believe I was dead. I couldn't control that. All I could do now was disappear and wait. I also had another mission, to rebuild myself. There were trails around the cabin, steep, rocky, and perfect for getting my body back in shape. Each morning I'd run until my lungs burned. Then I'd come back and lift, stretch, hit the old boxing bag I'd picked up from a pawn shop on the way in. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted readiness. After about a month, I finally wandered into the nearest town. It was small, quiet, friendly, unsuspecting. I found a computer store and picked up a basic laptop with a mobile internet dongle. Enough to keep an eye on the world without making noise. My last stop that day was the gun store. I walked out with a semi-auto 7mm hunting rifle, a Sig Sauer P228, and enough ammo to make sure I'd never be caught off guard again. The store also doubled as a pawn shop, so I threw in an old pair of boxing gloves and a heavy bag to replace the one Brian had lent me. On the drive back, I passed a hand-painted sign in front of a farmhouse. Puppies for sale. Curiosity got the best of me. I pulled over and knocked on the door. Inside, a kind old woman showed me to a litter of border collies. There was only one pup left. He was quiet, watchful, and a little nervous. Something about him just clicked with me. Maybe I missed my old dog. Maybe I just didn't want to be alone anymore. Either way, I brought him home. We made a good pair, two strays figuring it out day by day. A few weeks later, the news finally caught up to me. It started with a report about Susan Bates. She'd apparently fallen down a staircase and broken her neck. Tragic, they said. A freak accident. Then, on the day of her funeral, tragedy struck again. Her parents, General Bates, and the rest of their extended family died in a multi-vehicle crash on the highway. Just like that, the powerful Bates dynasty had been wiped from the earth. And who was left? Kelly Bates Easton. Now the sole heir to the Bates fortune. The article quoted Kelly saying she was deeply traumatized by the loss of her family and her husband, who died by suicide. It was strange, though. Every paper called my death an unfortunate accident, but the subtext kept hinting at suicide. Curious how they never made it official. Maybe someone didn't want too many questions asked. Maybe someone knew better. I forwarded everything I found to Brian. If anything happened to me, he had instructions. He would protect my family and he would deliver every piece of evidence, every name, every document, to the right people. That night, we sat together on his porch, beers in hand, staring out at the waves crashing just beyond the dunes. I told him everything. The early signs I'd missed. The subtle betrayal by Kelly. Her rekindled bond with Sandman. The pregnancy. The mounting threats against my life. I walked him through the news articles, the reports from Peterson's father, the eerie coincidences surrounding the deaths of the Bates and Peterson families. It took hours. Brian didn't say much. Just nodded, listened, and poured another drink when mine ran low. I showed him the final piece, the one detail that still made my skin crawl. A report from the hospital. A witness statement. The room number, 319. Third floor. The room where General Bates' only son had been found, minutes before the crash that ended the family line. I made my way to the hospital carefully, every step deliberate, my heart pounding harder the closer I got. I didn't take the elevators, too risky. I stuck to the stairwells, listening for echoes, footsteps, any sound that might spell trouble. By the time I reached the third floor, I nearly walked straight into a pair of security guards making their rounds. I ducked into a restroom just in time, holding my breath behind the door like a fugitive. After a few minutes, the hallway quieted, and when I peeked out, I saw the nurse's station was empty. It was now or never. Room 319 was just a few doors down. When I stepped inside, I was met with the soft beeping of machines and the faint sterile smell of the hospital. There, lying in the bed, was Peterson Sr., pale, still, and older than I remembered. Time had not been kind. He looked fragile, his skin drawn tight over his bones, a far cry from the hard-edged tycoon I once feared. I pulled up a chair and sat beside him. I didn't speak, just watched his chest rise and fall, slow and mechanical. Part of me had come here to get answers. Another part just wanted to see that he was still human, that he could be hurt like the rest of us. But I was running on fumes. I needed rest if I was going to finish this. I slipped out undetected, made it back to my motel and texted Brian, all clear. Laying low. Then I crashed. I didn't wake until nearly 11 a.m. the next morning. After a long shower, I shaved, dressed in clean clothes, and grabbed a bite to eat at a diner down the street. By 12:30, I felt like a person again. Steady. Focused. I called the hospital and asked to speak with Peterson Sr. The nurse put me through. He didn't sound surprised to hear from me. Yes, he said, voice low and gravelly, Justin Green is authorized for safe deposit box 112. He didn't ask questions. Neither did I. Before heading to the bank, I stopped at a barber shop and did what I should have done a month ago. I shaved it all off. The beard. The hair. Everything. What stared back at me in the mirror wasn't Roger Easton. It wasn't even the guy from the cabin. It was someone new. At the bank, I presented my ID and access confirmation. They led me to a small, cold room and set the metal box on the table in front of me. Inside was a thick folder. It looked like something straight out of a spy novel. Documents, photos, receipts, confidential memos. The report was detailed. Exhaustively so. Turns out, Greg Sanders and Kelly Bates weren't just a fling. From the moment they met, it had been instant. Mutual. Intense. But the narrative I'd been given, that she rejected him unless he got her father's blessing, was a lie. The two of them had planned to elope. Greg had already started the process to leave the army and join the police force. They were ready to disappear together. But somehow General Bates found out. And that's when everything changed. The general couldn't stomach the idea of his daughter marrying someone like Sandman. Instead of confronting them, he played the long game. He used Sandman's past, his ambition, and his reputation to drive a wedge between them. When Sandman was suddenly deployed to the Middle East under questionable orders, Kelly was left behind, angry, heartbroken, and alone. That's when I entered the picture. The general saw in me a useful pawn. A way to keep Kelly close, compliant. to keep her from chasing after Greg. And Kelly, she went along with it. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of pain. But she never really let go of him. All this I learned from the report. But what shocked me most? The source. Susan Peterson. Somewhere along the way, Kelly must have trusted Susan with too much. And when Doug died, killed by Sandman, Susan's bitterness cracked her silence wide open. She handed over every secret she had, and it painted a picture far more complicated than I'd ever imagined. Now I knew the real timeline. The real betrayals. And the lengths Sandman had gone to get back what he thought had been stolen. Brian had saved my life more than once. First on the battlefield, then with a cabin and a new name. He helped me when I was drowning in grief and rage, when I seriously considered ending it all. And now, with the truth in hand, he simply asked me, "What are you going to do now?" And for once, I didn't know. The people who used me had either died, disappeared, or gotten everything they wanted. The headlines had moved on. Kelly was grieving publicly. Sandman was untouchable. And me? I was a ghost. A memory. But sometimes ghosts don't stay buried forever. At some point, everything shifted. Sandman had turned his full attention to General Bates. That much was clear. And Kelly? She wasn't innocent in all this. She and Greg knew people were asking questions, and they'd started to put the pieces together. They must have realized Susan had talked. What they didn't understand was that Susan thought her wealth could shield her. She didn't see it coming. None of them did. They used the situation to their advantage, eliminating both Susan and the general in one sweep. Cling. Convenient. No alarms raised. Just grief on the surface and silence underneath. I left the motel that night, the cold truth of it all heavy on my chest. As I drove through town, memories came flooding in. Me and Sandman at the gym, the cabin, the countless moments I thought were real. And maybe they were, once. But not anymore. This had gone too far. I parked a good distance from the Bates estate and geared up. My truck held a duffel bag with everything I needed, night vision, weapons, and just enough adrenaline to override fear. I moved under cover of darkness, cutting through brush and staying low, until I reached the outer edge of the property. The place was massive. Cold. Quiet. The kind of mansion that looked more like a fortress at night. I set up on the perimeter and scanned the grounds. My night vision gear lit up the darkness in green silhouettes. Movement, there. Kelly. She walked briskly to her BMW and drove off, heading toward town. That left the house mostly empty. Or so I thought. I waited. The plan was simple. Watch, gather, leave. No confrontation. Not yet. But something went wrong. I heard the faintest crunch of gravel nearby. Movement, fast and deliberate. Before I could confirm, the power went out. Total blackout. My pulse spiked. Whoever had cut the lights knew I was there. I rotated slowly, scanning every inch of the darkness. I had no idea where Sandman was, but I knew he was close. I raised my weapon and fired toward where I thought the sound had come from, low and deliberate shots. But nothing. No return fire. No footsteps. Just silence. I'd given away my position. And I felt it. That stillness you feel before something bad happens. I braced for a shot that never came. Then headlights. Bright, blinding beams filled the perimeter as a car pulled into the driveway. For a split second I froze. I lowered my rifle just enough to peer past the glare. That's when I saw him. Sandman. He was lying on the floor of the hallway inside, a streak of blood across his forehead. I'd grazed him. A lucky shot. But he was alive, and starting to move. That's when I saw the knife. It was lying between us, closer to me than him. I didn't think. I grabbed it and rushed forward, every part of me screaming to end it. But Sandman wasn't unconscious. He'd been faking. Playing dead. And as I closed the distance, everything I thought I knew about him, the friend, the soldier, the brother I'd once trusted, vanished. What was left wasn't a man at all. Just the ghost of someone I should have seen coming.